Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions will please come to order. Please excuse my tardiness. I had gone to the Energy Committee to try to provide a quorum for markups, and I unsuccessfully, it didn't happen, so I left at 10 after. So we'll proceed ahead. I'm sorry to hold people up. This is another in a series of hearings as we work to reach a result by early spring on reauthorizing the Higher Education Act. Senator Murray and I will each have an opening statement, then we'll introduce the witnesses. We thank each of you for being here. After the witnesses' testimony, senators will each have 5 minutes of questions. Before we begin, I want to express my concern about the large number of senior positions in the Department of Education that haven't been confirmed by the Senate, even though this committee first approved their nominations in some cases as long as 3.5 months ago. For a while, the responsibility for this delay could be shared with the Trump administration, which was slow to make nominations, but not anymore. The responsibility lies solely with the Democratic minority, which is insisting on taking most of 1 week to confirm each nominee, knowing that there is not that much time for nominations on the Senate floor. So 1 year after President Trump took office, only the following 4 positions at the Department of Education have been confirmed and are on the job: the Secretary, the Assistant Secretary for Special Education, the Assistant Secretary for Legislation, the Chief Financial Officer. This committee has approved 4 other senior nominees awaiting a floor vote: the General Counsel, who was passed out of committee on October 18, the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, out of committee on January 18, Jim Blue, Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development, out of committee on December 13, the Deputy Secretary, out of committee on March 13. Since everyone knows the Senate majority will confirm these 4 nominees, and the President and the American people expect the President to be able to have enough administrators in place to be accountable for the federal activities in 6,000 colleges and 100,000 public schools, my hope is that the minority will quickly allow the Senate to approve these nominees. It's not only happening in the Department of Education. There are 103 nominations on the executive calendar awaiting consideration by the Senate. This doesn't include judicial nominations. To put this in perspective, on November 21, 2013, when Democrats thought the confirmation backlog was dire enough to use the nuclear option to break the Senate rules, there were 76 nominations on the executive calendar, less than today. Today we're looking at another important focus of our reauthorization of higher education: accountability, whether students are earning degrees worth their time and money. An important part of that accountability is to find ways to make sure students are not borrowing more than they'll be able to pay back. Today, when students do not make payments on their loans, colleges are held somewhat accountable under the current cohort default rate measure. I believe Congress should consider new accountability measures that are more effective at holding all individual programs at all colleges and universities accountable for the ability of their students to pay back their loans. There's a lot of discussion about federal student loan debt. While the amount spent on federal aid each year is high, about $120 billion, $28 billion in grants, which don't have to be paid back, and $92 billion in loans, which do, the average debt per undergraduate student is relatively low. At one of our previous hearings, Dr. Susan Dynarski testified, quote, "In the United States, typical undergraduate debt is less than $10,000 for those who don't complete a 4-year degree, and about $30,000 for those who do. What's exceptional about the United States is therefore not student borrowing, but a rigid, archaic repayment system that unnecessarily plunges millions into financial distress," unquote. Historically, most student loans have been repaid. Taxpayers recover most of their money. However, there are worrisome signs as we look ahead. Here's what the student loan repayment picture looks like today. There are 2 groups of borrowers repaying student loans. Nearly half, 46%, who are repaying their student loans, and a little more than half, 54%, who are in default or not making their payments on loans. Of the more than half who are not repaying their student loans, 21% are in default. 21% of all borrowers in default, meaning they have not made a payment in over 9 months. The current method of holding colleges accountable for students making their loan payments is based on the cohort default rate, the 21% of borrowers who are in default. There are another 33% of all borrowers who are not making their payments on time. These borrowers are not taken into account in the current default rate measure. About 2/3 of these borrowers are not making payments because of economic hardship, and 1 out of 3 are at least 5 days late on making a payment for a variety of reasons. The taxpayer should be concerned not just about the 21% in default, but also about the 33% of borrowers who are not making their payments on time. And then of the half who are making payments, nearly 2/3 of them are in the income-based repayment program. The income-based repayment program is a safety net for low-income borrowers enacted by Congress in 2007. It sets a cap on monthly student loan payments. If the loan's not repaid after 20 or 25 years at this cap payment rate, the loan is forgiven. Today, a portion of these borrowers, while considered in good standing, have a student loan payment of 0 because their income's too low. What was designed as a temporary safety net has become the standard where students expect their debt to be forgiven after a certain amount of time. This may be good for the student, but is not so good for the taxpayer. We'll not know the impact of so many borrowers being in the income repayment program for another decade, when the first set of borrowers begin to have their debt forgiven. Since the last bipartisan reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, the federal government has become the provider of all loans for students. I didn't agree with that, but now that the federal government is the bank, we must do what a bank does, which is to protect its shareholders, and the shareholders are the American taxpayers. When a commercial bank makes a loan, it underwrites the loan or checks the credit of the borrower to determine whether the borrower is able to pay the loan back. In the case of student loans, there's no underwriting, no credit check. Students borrow roughly $100 billion each year in individual loans that may go as high as $12,500 for an undergraduate and as high as the cost of tuition for graduate students. And as we've just discussed, students may pay their loan back based on their income, and if they're not able to pay it all back in 20 or 25 years, the loan may be forgiven. I'm not ready to turn roughly $100 billion in loans into grants. So we need effective ways to protect the taxpayer as well as the student. And as we continue our work on reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, I want to look at how we hold all schools, public, private, and for-profit, accountable when students borrow too much and are not prepared to pay those loans back. One way to do that is to provide students with more data on the cost of college and what their likely earnings would be in the curriculum or program they choose. Another way would be to remove barriers and encourage schools to counsel students about the amount of money they can afford to borrow. Another is to look at ways to hold the schools themselves more accountable. Several proposals by members of this committee, other members of Congress, outside organizations, these proposals reflect the interest in holding colleges and universities more accountable for students repaying their loans. One is a proposal from Senators Hatch and Shaheen. It proposes fixing the cohort default rate system to instead look at the percentage of students who fail to pay down at least $1 of their principal loan balance within 3 years. The House Committee on Education took an approach similar to Hatch-Shaheen, which required college programs to have at least 45% of borrowers in, quote, positive repayment status, unquote. Another proposal by the Hamilton Project suggests creating a cohort repayment rate, not to be confused with cohort default rate, to look at the percentage of federal student loan dollars that have been repaid in the 5 years after borrowers leave school. It would be possible to apply this at the program level as well, evaluating individual programs rather than applying a blanket sanction to a college that has both excellent and failing programs would help inform students' choices and spend federal dollars more responsibly. Using student loan repayment rates in an appropriate way to measure accountability for all programs at all of our 6,000 colleges and universities would be, in my view, a step in the right direction. To be clear, we want to ensure students are getting a quality education and that they are not borrowing more than they can afford to pay back to the taxpayers who are making the loan. This hearing and our continued conversations is one of our 5 key areas we need to address in our authorization of the Higher Education Act this spring. Just as we released white papers in 2015 on accreditation, risk sharing, and consumer information, my staff plans to release a staff white paper later this week intended to continue this thoughtful discussion of what it entails to have a robust accountability system. Senator Murray.
Well,